Hello there. Welcome to part 4 of my video series on the Bigme 1051. This is it. This is the final review. We're going to go into the pros and cons. I'm going to then go into the context about whether I can recommend the device or not, what use cases this is good for or isn't good for, and then we'll just kind of tie it all together with a bow. So let's go ahead and jump on in and see how I finally rated this particular device. So we begin with the primary pros, and these are potential reasons why you might be interested in purchasing this particular device. And it all begins with Google Play. Access to the Google Play Store means you have access to download any application that's there. Keeping in mind, of course, the fact that they're not all optimized for an e-ink screen, but certainly things like reading apps work really well, Kindle, Kobo, Google Books, and so on. Apps like Google News and, web browsers, all that sort of thing works particularly well on this device, and especially because it's in color. Some applications that you download on a black and white e-ink screen, the menus can sometimes wash out. So the advantage of Kaleido 3 Color here is that you can see those menus and you have access to more applications. So that's pretty much one of the biggest advantages of this device. And the performance of apps is generally really good. I don't really see any difference between the performance of apps on this device versus the main competitor, which is books. I think they're pretty much in parity with each other. So if your primary reason for buying the device was to go into apps and do that type of work, then this is a perfectly good device for that purpose. In addition to that, as mentioned, you do have Kaleido 3 Color. There's some controversy over this. Some people don't like Kaleido 3 Color. And some of the weaknesses are things like the pixel density is 150 ppi for color as opposed to 300 for black and white. It only recreates about 4,000 colors. And there's a darker screen as a result of having Kaleido 3. There's certainly notable downsides to that. But I find Kaleido 3 Color is still an excellent technology for this day and time. It handles refreshing really well. And it's also, when I open up, like, say, Kobo, and I'm looking at book covers, those book covers may not be rendered perfectly. In fact, they won't be, but they still look great just on their own because of the use of color. I still think Kaleido 3 Color has its place, hasn't been replaced yet in the e-ink sphere. The last thing I'll point out on the pros is just the general snappy performance. This is a pretty snappy device. You can go between different menus in the UI and launching apps. It does have really beefy internals that put it, again, pretty much on parity with what books offers as well. So now that we've gone through reasons why you might want to purchase this device, what are some potential reasons why you might not? And first on the list definitely is going to be price. Now I'll elaborate a little bit more on this at the end, but basically it's just not at a good price point relative to other competitors in this space, regardless of whether you're talking about the Note Air 4C or the Books Ultra C Pro. This comes at a premium, and I'm not sure that's justified. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's not justified. So we'll get into more detail on that later, but it is the primary reason why you'd pass on this particular device. Battery life is another potential issue. I was a little torn, though, about whether to include this as a primary or a secondary con. Battery life is kind of a little above the average in general, so it's not terrible, but there are other devices that have much better battery life, and so I think for that reason I decided to put it as a primary con. I don't think the battery life objectively is terrible. I think it's fine, just that there's other devices that have slightly better battery life. That's the reason why I put that here. There is, of course, ghosting. This is not unique to this device. Kaleido 3 suffers from ghosting. Books and Bigme handle ghosting differently, and both with its pros and cons. I'm not sure I have a favorite among the two. Maybe Books is a little bit better, but regardless, ghosting is a thing that you do have to deal with, and it's certainly present here. The fact that you don't have the ability to do any type of reference in notes, and what I mean by references is things like tags, keywords, any type of handwriting recognition where you can do search on handwriting, no search on any type of symbols. There's nothing in the note-taking app to be able to search within or across notebooks The only search functionality that exists is in titles, and it's case sensitive, so it's not particularly powerful. This is in stark contrast to players like Supernote, Books, Viwoods, Remarkable, all of which have some sort of reference features, some better than others, but at least they have them. It doesn't exist here at all, and that's really not good for a device of this type. It's true that you don't have those on Kindles or on Kobo, but those situations are basically, let's have reading with a pad of paper, and they're excellent at that use case. For something like Bigme, they kind of are straddled in between, the Kindles, the Kobos, and those other manufacturers I mentioned, and that's kind of puts them in a bit of a purgatory, frankly, as it relates to their note-taking app. It's really inexcusable that they don't have these features, and it's a major con. There is a large learning curve, very similar to Books. Not as bad as Books, I wouldn't argue. I think it's a little bit easier to get to know the Bigme, simply because Books offers a lot more features, so that's an inherent advantage that Bigme has, but you still have a learning curve over, say, a Kindle. It's not as refined as Books. So Books has just a smoother, more polished experience. And this was a big disappointment for me. Bigme's always had, for example, screens where maybe a little bit of Chinese comes up, even though the primary language selected was English. And I thought that with the Pocketbook acquisition of a portion of the Bigme company, there might seem more refinement in particularly languages that are in Europe, where Pocketbook has some expertise, but that just wasn't the case here. And so there were still a lot of situations where Chinese would pop up, or it wasn't as smooth as an experience with Books, just not as refined overall. Same with kind of the UI of particularly of the note-taking app. I'm not a huge fan of the UI in the note-taking app on Books. I think it's fine. I just think it could be better. But this is not even quite at that level. So a little bit disappointing, that something I hope that they would have improved on. And then, the reading app isn't anywhere near where Books is. And we saw in the previous video an example of pinch and zoom, much smoother on the Books device. The Books device can read much more file formats. I think that the UI on Bigme is a little bit better, but that's just simply because the Bigme does less. It's not a huge advantage Bigme has. It's not like they thought through the UI in any particular way that Books should study. It's just that because they do less, the UI isn't quite as cumbersome, but I will take the features of the Books UI, or Books Reader rather, and just deal with the UI as opposed to the other way around, and a big gap for Bigme here. I mean, the two major things these devices do is reading and writing, and I list both of these as major cons. So our attention then turns to what I call secondary pros and cons. And these are things that really stood out for me, but I'm not sure they rise to the level of influencing a buying decision. They're just positive or negative things that I've noticed that I just wanted to share. And first on the list is the fact that the Bigme does have a customizable UI. This is kind of curious. Books is really well known for its customization, particularly in the menus and their note-taking and reading app, but you get one look on its main UI. That's not the case here with Bigme. They have two. We showed that in the visual tour, and both of them are kind of nice. I prefer the app style, but there's also an office style, and it's nice to have that type of flexibility, and it's a unique characteristic of the Bigme device. I like the fact that with the lasso tool, whether it's the automated lasso tool or just in general, you have a quick button to delete an area. You can delete using the Books lasso tool, but you have to dig through a menu to get there. I think it was a little bit better implemented here, so I wanted to call that out. The hardware design is solid. I'm not saying it's the best hardware that I've ever used on an e-ink device, but it's definitely solid. There's no creaking on it. So yeah, a definite plus for Bigme, which is not unusual. They tend to have generally pretty good hardware. The global handwriting feature, which I talked about both in the visual tour as well as the previous video, is a really cool feature. I'm surprised that other companies haven't matched this, where you can basically create your own scrapbook of notes from various apps, or whatever you can see on the screen can get recorded into a notebook. Super powerful feature that Bigme's had for a while now. and really is kind of their killer app. Is it enough to save the overall? No, but it's a really nice feature, and it's still worth calling out. I like the new stylus that they're using. It has a nice texture. It's a little bit heavier, which I really liked. The eraser on the back's pretty good. I do kind of wish that it was a little more sensitive. So I like it where you just touch the eraser to the screen and then circle the area. This one you have to kind of press in a little bit, but that's a small issue with what I otherwise think is a pretty good stylus. The speakers are pretty good. I don't want to overstate this. These are not great speakers. You would not buy the device for the speakers. That's why I list it as a secondary pro. But they're totally functional. And if you want to watch YouTube videos, you want to listen to audiobooks, and you don't have Bluetooth speakers, you could use the speakers on this, and it would be just fine. An amazing selection of templates. I think this device might have the most templates I've ever seen on a device. And the templates are generally pretty good. Are they the best templates I've ever seen? I still think Remarkable probably has the highest quality templates, but there's some good templates here as well. Of course, you can import your own as PDF files, so that doesn't change. But it is worth calling out that they've done a good job in providing a really deep pool of selections to choose from. So now we move on to the secondary cons. And these are all the little things that I didn't like. I can get past them ultimately, but I thought they were negative enough to at least mention. And we'll start off with the AI eraser. This is actually the exact same situation with books, where if you do this scribble to erase, it's only going to delete the strokes the scribble touches. So it's not an area eraser, and I really think it could have been better implemented as an area eraser, as I think is the exact same issue with the books devices. So same problem here with Bigme as well. There's very little in terms of cloud services. You can back up notes, but bringing files on and off the device really is best done using a third-party app like OneDrive or Google Drive. They don't really have a good way of doing that. You can connect to a web browser to transfer files. That ability is there, particularly in the Reader app, but not in the note-taking app. I just thought they could have done a better job here, at least relative to what other folks do. I showed in the previous video I couldn't read a CBR file, which is really strange. A different app comes up other than their native reader, and it kind of leaves me stuck on a splash screen. Very strange. Not sure what's going on there. You can read comics through other apps, like for example, you can do Comixology or Kindle or what have you, but a little disappointed that the native reader couldn't read CBRs. The cover flap, which is really similar to what we saw with the Books Go 10.3, I did not like it on this device. On the Books device, I thought it was a little bit better implemented because it was a little more rigid. Here it was really hard to line up, so it didn't look kind of janky. It's functional, I guess, ultimately, but I didn't think it was as good of an implementation. And even with the Books Go 10.3, that's a little controversial. A lot of people don't like it. If you didn't like the Books Go 10.3 flap, you're going to hate it here. The cover really is a magnet for dust and dirt. I have an office that's relatively clean, but there is a lot of dust here, and it just collects on the cover. You can clean the cover, but it's a little bit difficult. There's something about the material that could have been done a little bit better, I think. You don't have the ability to do any type of links. So in something like a books device in the note-taking app, you can do links where you can link to another page in the same notebook or to other notebooks. And that allows you then to click on that and quickly jump to that location that you're linked to. That doesn't exist here at all in the Bigme device. The note-taking UI is, not terrible, but it could be better. Much like the Books UI, they're trying to shove a lot of stuff into a space. It works, but there's an opportunity here. I think other companies, Supernote, I think, does their UI way better, and they also have a complicated set of tools to choose from. So it can be done better, and certainly better than Bigme has done. Throughout testing this device, there's been occasional glitches. There was one crash, I think, that also happened. It's generally a stable device, so again, this is not a primary con. But it does happen, and I would be negligent at least not to mention that. And this is partly goes into the previous issue I mentioned, where it's not as smooth as refined of an experience. Again, you can work around it easily, but other people do it better. The OCR is fine. It's fine. It's not terrible, but I think Books and Supernote do a better job of translating handwriting into regular text. I have no scientific way of measuring this. My handwriting's pretty variable. So unfortunately, I can't do a real test, but my sense is the OCR isn't quite as good. It's still competent. I don't want to overstate this, but I think other folks do it a bit better. And then finally, the Reading App UI, similar to the Books Reading App UI, is not great. I think it's better than the Books UI, as I said earlier, but that's simply because they're not shoving as much functionality in there. That's not exactly a win. Much like Books, they could have done a better job with it, and so that sticks out, so I needed to mention that here as well. Okay, so having now gone over all the pros and cons, where does that leave us? Do I recommend this device or not? And I'll be honest with you, I don't think I can recommend this device for any use case whatsoever. Now, that's not to say it's a terrible device, but the problem ultimately is, here's the basics of it. Books can do pretty much anything Bigme can do, and they do it for less. That's the problem that Bigme has. Are there some things that Bigme brings to the table that Books doesn't do? Yes, but they're very incremental. They're things that ended up on my secondary pros list. So, whether you're talking about competing against the Note Air 4C or competing against the Ultra C Pro, Books delivers more at a lower price point, and I don't know how Bigme overcomes that. I think at its best, Bigme's best use case is around apps. So if you're buying an e-ink device mainly to focus on apps, like if you're reading on a Kindle or a Kobo, or if you're using Microsoft Office or Google Docs, if you're doing Google News, I think these things all perform great on this device. I always kind of go through this similar pattern as I'm dealing with Bigme devices. So I start off looking at the hardware, and everything's kind of, pretty good hardware. And then I look at what their Notes app can do, because that's what I use my e-ink devices for the most. And no search functionality is unbelievable that that's the case, and we'll get into that in just a second. And then I start to do the visual tour, and I focus heavily on the apps that Bigme puts on the device. And then my opinion of it goes back up, because there's a lot of interesting applications on the device. But then I start going into more depth, and I start pushing the device more, particularly in the reader. And then my opinion then sinks back down. And ultimately, that's kind of where I'm at. The issue really in being good at apps is that's not a primary use case usually for buying one of these devices. The strength of an e-ink device is reading and writing. How good's your note-taking app, and how good is the reading experience? And Bigme only is at parity with Books on the reading experience if you're talking about these Google Play apps. But if you're talking about the reader, Books' reader blows Bigme's away. And even though Bigme has done work to bridge the gap between themselves and Books, it's not nearly enough in order to close that gap, and not having that search and reference functionality is just a huge albatross around Bigme's neck at this point. So overall, I just can't recommend this device unless it were selling at a price point that was notably below Books' counterpart devices. If this was a $400 device, and we were talking about this device and the Note Air 4C, then there's a debate to be had there. And then it would focus more on, well, what's your use case? Yes, Books is better, but Bigme still has a competent note-taking app. And if your focus is more on the reading experience through apps, you just want note-taking on the side, that global handwriting is a feature you could really use, then you've got a compelling argument to go with the Bigme device. But Bigme isn't $100 cheaper. It's over $100 more expensive, and that math just doesn't work. I want to take a step back here and talk a little bit about Bigme as a whole, but focusing on their 10-inch e-reader, e-note-taking devices. And let's go back to last year. When I first bought the InkNote Color Plus, it was one of the first 10-inch models with a Kaleido 3 screen. It had a nice film on it, so I really liked the writing experience on that device. It had its issues, and we've kind of talked about a little bit of those in this review process. But that's when I was most optimistic about Bigme. Now, a few months later, the Note Air 3C comes out. The price point was pretty unbelievable, and it really undercut Bigme. But Bigme made a decision at that point to sell a light version of their device that made the right sacrifices. Really, honestly, there were things about the Color Plus in terms of storage capacity, in terms of RAM, that simply weren't necessary. And their light version basically got rid of some of that excess, brought the price point down, and was more competitive. Now, I still think the Note Air 3C was the better device of those two, but you could start to have a reasonable argument between the two. That's probably the point where I felt the best about Bigme, because I thought they were starting to address the two issues they had against books, which is, number one, their price point relative to books, which does more for less, and number two, the fact that they were kind of starting to bridge the gap. We were seeing updates come out on a fairly regular basis that were improving the device. And so that's when I really kind of thought, well, this is a good competitor for books. I like the future of this company, and I'm pretty anxious to see what they were able to do in the coming year. Well, here we are a year later, and what have they done? Actually, all those positive trends that I was starting to see basically went away. They stopped selling at a discount. There's, this device is a great example of that. There's no light version of this device, at least as of this video. It's way overpriced for what you get. You could say similar to other models in the Bigme lineup, including the Pocketbook EO. And then in terms of bridging the gap, it would be too dismissive to say that Bigme hasn't done some steps to bridge that gap, but they're very small steps, I would argue. And books didn't really, innovate a ton in this past year either. So books, generally speaking, was stagnant. This was an opportunity for Bigme really to make a move, and they didn't. So at least not in a significant way. So I'm not sure what to think about Bigme now. They really had an opportunity to take that momentum that we saw last year and build on it. And I think they've lost a whole year, frankly. Again, that's a little dismissive. They have made some improvements to their device. It's hard to talk about them in black and white terms and be accurate. But generally speaking, I don't think that's an unfair statement to make. And that makes me question, where are they going forward? They have to dramatically reduce the cost of their devices and increase their functionality, or they're just going to be continued to be left in the dust by books. I just can't think of any reason why someone right now would buy a Bigme device over a book device unless there was a price discount. And that's the exact reason why I gave an award and recommended the Bigme S6 Color Plus, because that device did come at a discount versus its book's counterpart, and it also played to all their strengths, which is working with Google Play apps, de-emphasizing their note-taking and reading apps. So that one device was kind of a unicorn in the Bigme lineup. But right now, the way that they're releasing devices with high price points, I just don't see why they're relevant. And I question their relevancy going forwards. Now, could they turn it around? Absolutely, they can turn it around. I don't think that their gap on the note-taking app, for example, is that huge. If they just add tags the way that Viwoods and Remarkable have them, which isn't nearly as good as books, but at least it's something. And then you have some way to search on pages in a notebook, between notebooks. That would be a massive step in making their note-taking app more relevant. Work on that UI, make that a little bit nicer. I personally like having just one bar. If you want to have extra bars that can come and go, that's fine, but put like your pen tray on your main bar and that type of thing. I think there's opportunity there. Actually, oddly enough, Bigme's UI and their note-taking app, going back almost a year ago, I think was better than the one they have now, and actually they should think about going back to it. So that's just my personal opinion on that. But if you do those couple of things, I think you bridge the gap significantly on the note-taking app. Yes, books will still have the better note-taking app, but you've really done a massive job in adding the right functionality to the device. Then work a little bit. You've got Pocketbook. Use their talents to refine your UI and make that look nicer, make it consistent depending on the language you select. Get rid of these little bugs, make it a nicer experience. These are all things Bigme can do. They just didn't do it in the past year. So it's a question mark about whether this company has the right focus and is serious about competing in this space. Right now, they're not. Very clear. There's no reason why you should buy one of these 10-inch devices from Bigme until they either solve their gap in functionality and their gap in price point, ideally both. Then they would become relevant, and they can do it. It can be done, but we've got to see more out of them than we've seen over the past year. Okay, that's my review of the Bigme 1051. I did actually enjoy using this device, and as dour as I've been in this video about them, there is a lot to like. The problem is there's this company called Books, and they do it all a lot better. So that's what Bigme has to come to terms with and figure out how they're going to compete in the marketplace. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, please put those down below. I'll try to answer them the best I can. Until then, I will see you next time.